Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Lisa Watson, President of City Club's Board of Governors. For more than 100 years, the City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered today in the Sentinel Hotel and welcoming all of you joining us via KGW's website, Facebook feed, or news app, X-Ray FM, or on Open Signal's community media television stations. The generous support of City Club's media partners and corporate sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to recognize City Club's fall sponsors, Avangrid Renewables and Morel Inc., and I'd also like to thank First Interstate Bank for their support. Please show our appreciation. Today, we welcome Curtis Robinhold, the new Executive Director of the Port of Portland. Robinhold is well known in Oregon political circles, most recently as the Chief of Staff to Governor Kitzhaber, but before that, he was the CEO of Energy RM, an energy efficiency finance company, and worked on alternative energy projects at BP. Robinhold is the first new Executive Director at the Port of Portland in 16 years and has been thrust in the middle of many complex issues, including a Superfund cleanup, new realities in container shipping, and a growing demand for air travel. Today's conversation offers a fascinating window into how commerce works in our region and what's ahead for our growing state. Interviewing him today is Derek Olson, president of World Oregon. World Oregon seeks to broaden and deepen public awareness and understanding of international affairs, engaging Oregonians with the world and with each other. Please join me in welcoming them both.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I'd like to start first by asking you, Curtis, to talk about what you see as the top priorities for the Port of Portland under your leadership, and then we can dive into some more specific questions.
Great, thank you, Derek, and thank all of you for being here today. It's a real treat. Well, let me start answering the question just from a broad perspective and maybe share a little bit more about what the port is and a little bit about what it isn't, and then talk about priorities for the time ahead. The port is really three large businesses. We're a public entity. We're a part of the state of Oregon. Our commission is appointed by the governor, 9 members. 2 of my commissioners are here, very intimidatingly sitting in the front row. President Jim Carter and Michael Alexander, 2 of our commissioners at the port. We are a marine business with 4 marine terminals in the Willamette River and the Columbia, 3 airports, one that everyone knows, PDX, but also 2 general aviation airports in Hillsborough and Troutdale. And we are the largest owner and developer of industrial property in the state of Oregon. We have 5 business parks that are in the Tri-County area that really seek to develop industrial jobs in the region. So we're a rather complex organization. We have about 800 employees, and our annual revenues are about $300 million. So we're about the size of a mid-sized company, but we leverage those capabilities for much broader impact. So for me, lots of issues that were raised in the introduction. I'd say looking forward, we're really focused as an organization on 3 big categories. First, really trying to build an airport for the next generation. PDX, I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about, is really under a lot of pressure from growth, and we're trying to meet that in a very thoughtful and community-oriented way. Second, to really rethink what our marine business does and what it looks like, how it engages with the community, and how we develop opportunities for Oregon companies to get their products to market. And then third and lastly, really leveraging skills that we have in that industrial development, brownfield redevelopment area to engage on challenging issues like Superfund and job creation in the region.
Great. Thanks for that overview. And one just short philosophical question before we dive in a little bit more in specifics. As the port sits as a fulcrum on trade and transportation, and there's a view towards making the world a more peaceful, connected, prosperous place, yet there's so many forces fighting against that. How can the port push more on the positive side of that?
Wow, okay. Thank you for that. It's a great question. I'd say first, the port is really deeply engaged in trade issues first and foremost. And part of the ethos at the port is that we can lead with trade and economic conversations, but those will take us to relationships. And for us, those relationships are both regional but also trans-Pacific. I'd say, most recently the shift away from a trade policy that's open and encourages free trade is discouraging for us. It's those sorts of relationships that we have found really create ties between Oregonians and folks in other parts of the world. It's hard to fight your friends if you're doing business with them and if you have personal relationships with them. So we've seen that for many, many years, from Oregon connecting to Japan, but also increasingly that's Korea and Vietnam and China, and of course lots of long-term historical connections to Europe. So I'd say the personal connection is how we lead. We just celebrated last night, as you know, a direct flight from Portland to Mexico City with Aeromexico. It began last Friday. It's a daily service provided by Aeromexico in combination with their partner Delta. And it's that sort of building of relationships into all of Latin America that is really a great opportunity for us. And at the port where we feel like we put all of our eggs, it's really in building those relationships that can grow and build connections for Oregonians.
Great. And building off that, you talked about the Aeromexico launch, Delta's expanded service now both to Amsterdam and London in addition to Tokyo. Is there another market that you see or is on your wish list of as the traffic continues to grow where you might want to have additional international connections?
It's a great question, and my extraordinary wife Angela is here as well. And when I first got the job at the Port of Portland, she said it'd be great if you could get a connection to London and to Paris. And literally 6 months later, Delta announced that they were going to fly to London, and I told her that was all me, honey. I was in charge of all those decisions. We are close to maxed out on our international destinations, and we at the port don't decide where those connections are made. Those are decisions made by airlines, and they essentially fly them if they can make money doing that. And so we most recently in May announced the direct flight to London. It's seasonal on Delta, and just announced again, celebrating last Friday, this connection to Aeromexico. Those are both right at the edge of profitability. Oregonians are really going to need to fill those planes to make them profitable. The only other option I see out there in the near term is perhaps a Paris or another European destination. In the summer, especially in seasonal traffic, those planes get filled up. We could fill essentially any plane you set down, but the airlines want to see that those are consistently filled and that they're not just filled for a 3-month window. I'll note in the longer run, and it's one of the questions I get almost as much as I get questions about being on the public announcement speaker in PDX and about the carpet, is when are you going to fly to Shanghai? And it's interesting that while we have a lot of volume from Oregon bound for Japan, we don't have that same level of volume to China yet. And so I think the Chinese connections will be made in the shorter term with a connecting flight, and in the longer run, we all expect that market to grow. Eventually, I expect we'll get something like a Shanghai flight.
Thank you. And as you mentioned, there's been a tremendous growth in passengers. I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 million a year. There's been a number of expansions over the decades at PDX. I think the current one is estimated at $1.3 billion over 5 years. Can you talk about what that means for the travelers as far as maybe some inconveniences they have to put up with, but what's the payoff at the end and why you're going through this?
You bet. The actual number that we're at last year is 18 million passengers, and if you think about the size of our community in the state, that means everyone in the entire state of Oregon is flying at least 3 times, or the equivalent of, through PDX. We expect to be at 19 million passengers by the end of this year, so we just continue to grow very rapidly. The structure that we have at PDX, while people like it a lot, it is neither seismically resilient, nor can it really bear the volumes that we're seeing, especially during the week and in the morning hours. You get a lot of backup in the security lines. We've done a lot on our own to try to manage that, expanding some security lines. You'll all know the sort of newish exit lanes that enables us to move more people through those entry lanes. We've also, you may have noticed, we've taken TSA out of the sort of the announcement phase where it says there's someone there telling you to take off your shoes or someone carrying the bins back and forth. Those are now port contracted employees so that we can help keep the TSA team working on security. But we've run out of options, and what we're doing now, as you referenced, is really it's about a 10-year project, approximately $2 billion of investment. We call it PDX Next, and it's a series of projects, 5 really big ones, the biggest of which is what we call the terminal core, where you enter and have a ticket lobby and the Oregon market and security lanes. It's about $1 billion we're going to spend there to make it seismically resilient and also enable us to get up to 35 million passengers a year, up from the 19 that will be this year. And that is just really trying to keep ahead of the growth that we're seeing in the region. Actually, it was just today a story in the Oregonian about housing and transportation not being able to keep up with this remarkable growth that we see in the region. And without casting too many aspersions, I'll just say we look to the north at SeaTac and the volume that they have moving through the airport. It's the one airport in the western United States growing faster than ours, and they simply have not been able to keep up with their growth, and it's a real bottleneck. We're seeing that in a lot of major cities, and we're trying to avoid that. So we're going to hope for and ask for a lot of patience. We're really focused on safety as we do this construction, but also in trying to keep that sort of connection to the community, the zeitgeist that Portland loves and expects out at PDX with local providers, local restaurants, minority and emerging small business engagement. And so it's a challenge, but we're really focused on it.
And looking at that, that's such a huge project with big social impact. From the lens of equity inclusion, when you're spending that much money and you have such an impact on jobs in the community, what are you doing to make sure that you make the most of it?
It's a very good question. I'll just say, maybe perhaps more broadly answering around equity, that we have really spent the last couple of years with great leadership from our commission and some real strong staff engagement, really focused on equity at the port and our role in the community. Not just in things like hiring, although we do have targets now that are part of our performance measures, and it's in our bonus program at the port, recruiting both women and communities of color into the port. We're also engaged in trying to figure out how we keep those employees. Interestingly, that's one of the bigger challenges that we've got at the port. We can get folks in the door, but they come in and don't see communities that they're sort of comfortable with, or they don't feel like it's home, and we need to work harder to make sure people come and stay when they're employees. We also have a great contracting focus. Last year, our emerging small business numbers measured by the state, minority women, veterans, emerging small businesses have been 37% of port contracts. I'd say in and amongst public bodies in the region, that's a real leadership position. Last year, there's about $20 million with those small contractors. It's a real focus in contracting, and it will continue to be in terms of this broader $2 billion work. You know, interestingly, one of the challenges you come up against when you're doing a single $1 billion contract is there are only so many contractors who are capable of that scale of a project. We require them to bond for the whole value of the project, and that is really a barrier for many contractors, and large ones and small ones. So we also have a mentorship program, a protege mentor program, where we couple emerging contractors with port employees, but also with successful contractors, and have created this process where folks can learn how to bid into the system, but also how to be successful. Last year, former proteges were $5 million of contracting at the port. So it's good. There's still a lot of work to do, but I'd say as a team, we're pretty proud of that effort.
You touched on the local companies' retail at the port, which I think a lot of people would agree is one of the reasons why it's a special place. There's been some talk lately in the press about how that dovetails with wage rates for folks working at those. Is there been any more movement on that, or is that just sort of an ongoing discussion?
No, it's not only an ongoing conversation. I'd say it's been a conversation for many years. This program essentially was established about 20 years ago with things that I'd say a lot of Oregonians really value when they travel. Street pricing, when you come into the airport, you're not going to buy a $6 bottle of water. It's going to be priced the same as it is downtown. But also this focus on local flavor, and on emerging smaller businesses. One of our favorites at the airport is Bambuza, which is owned by a local couple that are fantastic and really have a great focus on their employees and their product. So it's I'd say a part of a broader conversation, and the Commission is actively engaged in the conversation. We're teed up for early in the new year to have a real review of, let's have a look at how it's going. The real pressure out there, and it's not an easy place to do business, is that in order to make up for the street pricing element or the requirement that we put on our tenants and concessionaires, is you have to do a lot of volume to make up the difference. And there's a concern that is expressed by some individuals, but also Unite Here, the union, has said, you know, you're putting downward pressure on employee pay. And so we really want to have that as part of the conversation. What are the ups and downs of the overall program? And I'd say, as a whole, it's one of the things I hear about most. People like it. They want it to function. They love coming in and having lots of options so that you can do Bambuza, but you can also go to McDonald's if you want, or Burgerville for that matter. So, you know, some really great options. We also announced earlier this year we've done the last of really 3 big rounds of renewal inside the airport. So next year we're adding Deschutes Brewing and Hopworks to the mix. So there'll continue to be a great mix of Oregon companies and flavors. And it's been a lot of fun, actually, to engage on that front of the business.
Great. Transitioning from the airport, you mentioned a little bit about industrial lands. I wonder if you could dive in more on that. How do you partner with folks like Prosper Portland, Business Oregon, Greater Portland, Inc., in trying to attract investment, whether that's from domestic or foreign companies? I think if you can give the audience a little bit better sense of the port's role, because I think most people don't realize what a player the port is in industrial land development.
Yep, thank you. That's it's a very complicated question, but I'm going to try to answer it. I'd say very broadly, the reason the port is in this business is that it's in our defining statute. We will engage on industrial development, and what that means has sort of changed over the years. But for the past 15 years, really, that's been a focus on bringing large lot industrial properties into the market. The idea was really that those properties would help bring traded sector goods and traded sector jobs into the region. The notion there being that the traded sector has higher paying jobs, has jobs that are in the $50,000 to $80,000 a year range, as opposed to the $25,000 to $50,000 a year range. And I'd say on development of those properties, we've really had an extraordinary record. Developed many things that people recognize, like Cascade Station, but also essentially the bulk of Rivergate, where the Willamette and the Columbia River come together. More recently, we brought a Superfund site out in Troutdale, the Troutdale Reynolds Industrial Park, into the market. It is now the home to several thousand jobs, and most recently the announcement of an Amazon facility out there with 2,000 jobs. Those developments in particular in Troutdale and in Gresham have been really meaningful contributors to those local economies. They fill the gap of employment that was really problematic, especially in the recession. And I'd say we sort of ticked the box, achievement, and done. But I think what we've started to see is this disconnect between traded sector jobs and higher wages. A lot of the traded sector employment that we're seeing now is around warehousing, around logistics, filling orders, moving packages. One of the largest employers out at Troutdale is FedEx Ground. They have 1,100 jobs. It's essentially moving packages around, and the average wages out there are in the kind of mid-teens or even low teens. And for us, the real question looking forward is, what are we going to do about that? What's our role in the space? And we're very actively engaged in trying to figure out how we engage in a way that is productive and really focused on some of those jobs that are higher paid and more meaningful contributors to the economy. We're working now on one deal out in Gresham that will be more like that, smaller manufacturing, more like 50 or 60 jobs, but hopefully also higher paying jobs, and it's a big challenge.
For our broadcast audience, this is Derek Olson. I'm the president of World Oregon, and I'm having a conversation with Curtis Robinhold, the new executive director of the Port of Portland. Going back into the questions, We talked about the airport expansion. Are there environmental or health concerns about that you're focusing on, or is the environmental focus more about the Portland Harbor cleanup that you mentioned next to old industrial land?
I'd say we have an environmental lens that we're using on everything that we do. At PDX, we actually have a great record. PDX, most people don't know, although you'll notice that we separate waste, and we have a great waste diversion program that diverts over 90% of the waste out of PDX. We're also 100% renewable at the Port of Portland. So we've really had, I'd say, a long-term vision about engagement on environmental issues. Superfund and the rest of the community impacts of our business are, I'd say, another level, and one that we're really working on a lot. I'm sure we can talk a lot about it if you'd like. Superfund, the issue itself, or the declaration itself, is now 17 years since the 10-mile stretch of the Portland Harbor was identified as a Superfund site. We, as the port, are long-term owners, operators. We are a potentially responsible party, like 140-odd other parties in the region. And we feel, as a public entity, we really have to play an active role, a leadership role, in moving that cleanup effort forward. So it's going to take a good long while. I'd say there are a lot of mixed signals out there about who's doing what, but it's something that we're very serious about. We've spent, as an organization, about $100 million so far in this 17 years, and we have only done a few small projects to initiate cleanup. So we're hopeful that in the course of the next couple years, we'll be leaning more into some identifiable progress there.
Thanks. Last month's trade mission to Asia with Governor Brown brought about the announcement of the resumption of limited container sea service to Terminal 6. Is this a hint of things to come? Is that looking to grow? And should we read into it that the management labor troubles that have gone on at Terminal 6 are over, or is this sort of a detente?
Yes, they're over. Next question. Well, so let me, first by way of background, Terminal 6 is on the Columbia River. It's about 400 acres. It's a very large terminal facility. It was created as a container terminal and has a number of large cranes that, if you were in the 70s or 80s, we could have taken the biggest vessel floating on the seas. At the time, the largest vessels were about 5,000 containers on a single vessel. Now, the largest vessel is at 22,000. 4 times and growing. Just recently, the Wall Street Journal had a story about the 50,000 container vessel being created in the market today. And so, just getting your head around that. We're a challenged container terminal. We're 107 miles up the Columbia River. Our draft is 43 feet between our terminal and the ocean, so it's challenging. The large vessels are never going to make it up here. But what we really have sought to do at T6 is to create more pathways for Oregon shippers to get their products to market and to receive cargo from Asia, primarily. Historically, there's also been European service. This most recent announcement that Swire Resources, interestingly, a nice nexus with the aviation business, it's the same parent company as Cathay Pacific, who is now our direct air cargo service to Hong Kong. The Swire Resources, a shipping company, is going to bring a monthly service in beginning in January, and it will have some containers on that service. Interestingly, the base cargo is actually a Daimler product, Western Star trucks, manufactured here in Portland, that will be loaded at T6 onto these vessels, taken down to Australia and New Zealand. We'll likely have a stop in Asia as well. What that does for us is really starts the wheels turning on having the gate open at T6, enabling trucks to come and bring cargo, set it down, and wait for pickup. As I mentioned, it's a 400-acre facility. Only about half of that is the container terminal. It includes an 8-track rail yard, which is a great opportunity for moving containers in particular. It also has a large auto import and export business. It's the home of Ford exports. They arrive on a rail car from Michigan and other states in the middle of the country, bound for China. There are 200 Teamsters who work at Terminal 6, essentially outfitting these large Fords for the Chinese market. So it's just a really fascinating piece of the international economy.
Speaking of, continuing on the trade theme, the trade relationship between Oregon and African countries is pretty small, but studies show that a lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa are really emerging, booming markets. With the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now the U.S. out of that, is there any thought to encourage Oregon exporters to look to Africa or other emerging markets, since we don't have the path going forward, it seems, on some of our traditional markets?
You know, I'd say which markets we focus on is really driven by shippers and by those companies and interests themselves. What we try to do is provide the structure, the infrastructure, and the framework so that folks can get their products to market in a relatively inexpensive way. The African market is especially remote from us because you have to get there in some obtuse way. And I think it is challenging in a lot of ways, but not impossible. One of the, I'd say, more obvious choices is a north-south trade with South America and Central America. We have not been very deeply into that trade route, but it's one that is certainly possible. You know, increasingly what we're seeing is a lot of Oregon agricultural products, especially value-added agricultural products, finding their way especially to Asia. But as those South American countries begin to be more vibrant, middle-income kind of countries, I expect we'll see more. You know, interestingly, this morning we saw the results of the EU-Japan free trade agreement. They have essentially said they're going to create a free trade zone, which will make up a quarter of the global economy. We're not in that. And I think this is the real threat that TPP and the backing away from this Trans-Pacific Partnership concept presents to Oregon, and I'd say especially the Western United States, is a lot of those trade pathways are continuing. The world and world history will proceed without us. China is really trying to engage on a lot of cross-border trades in Asia in particular, and that's disconcerting for Oregonians, and I'd say for those of us expecting our economy to really generate export-oriented products, they've got to go somewhere, and the world in which we trade freely has treated Oregon very well.
It's interesting you mentioned the EU-Japan deal, because the other massive U.S. Potential deal that has fallen off the radar screen entirely is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which was proposed between the U.S. and the EU. Absent that, it still seems, though, that Europe is going to be a key trade partner for us, not only for passenger traffic and through the airport, but also for exports and foreign direct investment. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you know, there's so much wealth in those markets, especially in the European market, consumer wealth that's looking for the best products they can find. A lot of our hazelnuts, for example, end up in Europe and are put into chocolates that we all love. I know our little girls love them. The idea that the trade routes would stop is silly. But what will happen is that competitors will emerge, and where the ability to trade is not encumbered by high tariffs, they will succeed and we will not. And so that's the longer term threat. We need to stay engaged in these markets, continue to build relationships. And for the port's essentially perspective, we want to make sure we can enable those from an infrastructure point of view. And it's going to be a big challenge going forward. You know, it's interesting to note this has been a busy 48 hours in trade. As you know, the EU and the British government have also come to basic terms on what their divorce looks like, which leads you to the next question about what's trade look like with one of the largest consuming nations in Europe. So, you know, it's really for us a longer term play about how do we help get Oregon products to market and how do we make sure those connections are real.
So when you sum that up, the airport, the industrial lands, and then the shipping trade, what's the combined impact then you have not on the greater Portland metro economy, but the state of Oregon, for that matter, Washington as well? I mean, what do you see that going forward? Is that growing? Is it shifting? I mean, you've talked a little about some of the trends and the challenges, but what's your vision of where we're going to be at in 5 or 10 years as far as the port's impact on that larger economy?
Yeah, there's lots of good data about the actual, the physical impact, and I think that's important data. The 2016 numbers are kind of in the range of 30,000 jobs and tens of billions of dollars. But I think for us, increasingly looking forward, it's about what's our community impact. One of the phrases I shared with our team at the port is, I'd like us to not just be close to the business community, but the whole community. And that's one of those questions we're really asking ourselves looking forward. How do we help in the region? How do we engage on a community basis in a way that's productive and helpful without leaving our core mission, which is really around industrial development and connecting Oregonians to other markets? So in the long run, I expect, in the next 5 years, it will feel different about where our focus is, but it'll have a lot to do with how our neighbors, how the region engages with us and connects to those markets.
Great. Again, this is Derek Olson. I'm the president of World Oregon, and we're having a conversation with Curtis Robinhold, the new executive director of the Port of Portland. I'd like to shift here to open up the floor for questions from City Club members. Asking a question is a privilege of City Club membership. We encourage you to come to the microphone. We also encourage questions from Twitter. Tweet in to City Club, and they will pass the questions on to me. Just a reminder, have a brief question so we can have as many as possible, and we'll go to our first question here at the mic. Sir.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Robinhold. I can't think of a more universal point of pride in this entire region than our airport. And it's not just street pricing. It's the entire atmosphere of the place, and among other things, being treated like an adult. But I have a question. It's been alleged over and above the street pricing issue that you all, in terms of contracting out labor and even your own employees, are not paying a living wage. SeaTac seems to be doing just fine at $15 an hour. Where do you stand, and how would you feel about a mandate that requires you and your contractors to pay what many people consider a living wage?
Great. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for the compliment. I agree with you. It's great. It's a great point of pride. I know for a lot of us who work at the port, it's a great entry point because everyone wants to talk about the airport, and we're very proud of it. So to your question, we've got about 800 employees at the port, and just as a we're a public employer, so in terms of union organizing, we are neutral by law. We do, however, have 9 unions inside the port, and there are 15 unions out at the airport itself, and they're all welcome to organize as they will. Inside the port, there isn't anyone who earns less than $15 an hour, so a $15 an hour minimum would not affect us directly. The real concern for us around a minimum or a minimum just at the airport is that throws off the market around what street pricing looks like, what pay in the connecting markets looks like. We organizationally said we support a broad increase in the minimum wage when it was in front of the legislature a year or 2 ago, and I personally absolutely support an increase in the minimum wage. We have one now. It's on a path over the course of a couple of years that hits 15, I want to say in 4 years. But the challenge for us is that if we have a wage that is different from surrounding markets, then we start to throw off what street pricing looks like. And while we can advocate for an increase in everyone's wages to come up to a minimum level, if it's just at the port, it throws off that relationship. And so that's the primary concern. It's not around folks not being paid enough or folks being paid too much. It is, I'd say, broadly an interesting question with ports along the West Coast. As my predecessor, Bill Wyatt, used to say, you've seen one port, you've seen one port. They're all very different, and the factors that come into comparisons are also different. The cost of living in Seattle is certainly a lot different than it is here, although that margin, I'd say, is growing more narrow. So we're certainly supportive of an overall increase in the minimum, but have some really specific concerns about just at the airport. We also have some other ancillary issues. I won't get into too much, but for example, what is the airport? Does it include Cascade Station, where employee parking lots are? Does it include out to I-205? So where do you draw the circle? Could probably resolve that, but our real issue is treat us like you treat everybody else, and we're happy with whatever that change might be.
Thank you. Next question from the audience, please.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. Speaking of where do you draw the circle, right now we have a Port of Portland, obviously, and we have other ports on the river. We have this difficulty, seemingly, of getting across the Columbia. And that's also true with respect to high-speed rail, which obviously relates to how much airport traffic we have between Portland and Seattle. So I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are, having been on the job a while now, about the possibility of having a bi-state port, like they have in other parts of the country, that seem to manage to get things across rivers without the difficulty we have. And also, if the port were given, if this port were merged and we had a bi-state port, how do you think your relationship is with the community to take on those difficult challenges? Because frankly, I've mentioned this idea to people I know, and someone said, "The port? Are you kidding me?" Which really surprised me, and it sort of suggested there's a public relations or a relationship difficulty between the port and the metro area, which I was surprised about, frankly. And I'm curious about what you think about those two things. And what about the capacity of growing the port to a bi-state port and your relationship with the Portland region to kind of take on those difficult challenges?
That's great. Thank you, Jim. You know, I'd say the theory is a whole lot easier to get to than the practice. And the idea of a bi-state port, and the one that everyone points to, is New York, New Jersey. And I'll just say we're a lot different from New York, New Jersey. And I'd say the port there wishes they looked more like we do. Essentially, to do a bi-state port, you need an act of Congress. So there's a bit of a hurdle there. But that being said, I think there's some interesting aspects to it. We've looked regionally at our neighbors, and we have very cooperative relationships and friendly relationships with not just the Port of Vancouver, but also the Oregon and Washington ports down the river and up the river. So I'd say broadly, conceptually, no huge hang-ups about it, although you really start to ask the question, why? What would you get out of that? And while Vancouver has a much smaller population base, they have roughly the same amount of public subsidy or public input in terms of property tax. For us this year, I mentioned we're about a $320 million port. We get $12 million from a property tax in the Tri-County area. They get roughly the same amount for a much smaller port. So you might have some differences in view about how the money gets spent, what you do. I'd also say there's a slightly different sense of focus. Over there, on the other side of the river, they have a lot more land than we do, but a lot less, excuse me, I'm trying to say this in a friendly way, capability. We're a larger organization. We can tackle larger problems. We have, I'd say, a deeper expertise just in our scale. So indeed, the transportation issues are very real, and especially transportation across the bridge is one that is just getting worse, and you just don't see any end in sight. I am now serving on the regional advisory committee to the Transportation Commission around congestion pricing. We just met for our second time yesterday, and the port has said we support congestion pricing. It's good for freight mobility. It's the most effective and economic way to get traffic when you want it, and not all at the same time. So, you know, we don't yet see a path to a new bridge. I don't know when we have another conversation about a new bridge, although just simply from a sustainability and a resiliency perspective, we need one. We have a real problem. We will have a real problem with the interstate bridge whenever we have a large earthquake event. So cooperation exists. I'll also note, you know, we sit on each other's economic development committees. The Clark County Economic Development sits with us on air service development. It's a friendly relationship. I just haven't seen a clear path to why you do that, and that's really, you know, if there is a barrier, I'd say that's it. There's a secondary question you didn't ask, but I'm going to answer anyway, which is the state of Oregon has 23 public ports, and we are frequently asked, well, what would you think of running all the ports? Or what about the 6 ports? Or, what if you could do this and that? And I would just say that's really got to be a local, each locality has to make up their own decisions about how they operate and what they do. There are really only 2 ports that are statewide, and that's because they're appointed by the governor of the state. So Governor Kate Brown appoints our commission and the commission for the Port of Coos Bay, interestingly. But there are 21 other ports in Oregon, some of whom do very well and others not so well. And I just say the communities need to make up their own mind about how they want to engage there. And just from a scale perspective, it's a very hazardous position for us to be in to say we think we should start running the port of Whatchamahoo or whichever it is. My hometown of Eugene, if they had a port, would we want to run it, right? It's more up to those local communities.
Again, this is Derek Olson, the president of World Oregon, and I am interviewing and we're hearing questions for Curtis Robinhold, the new executive director of the Port of Portland. If you've written a question on an index card, please hold it up for City Club staff to collect. You can also submit questions through Twitter using the hashtag #FridayForum. We'll try to read at least one index card question and one from Twitter. We also, as we have at the microphone, City Club members can ask their questions. It's a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. So if you could, we'll go to the next questioner.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. From what I understand, when containers come in, not very many of them can be searched. Like maybe it's 1%, 2%, I'm not sure. I have not heard of us having any problems with human trafficking or drug trafficking. What are our security measures to make sure that that doesn't happen?
It's a great question. They are actually all scanned, and while I'd love to say I can't tell you exactly the security measures because I can't let other people know that, the actual answer is I don't know that. In part because it's not our remit. Customs and Border Protection is present at the container terminal, and when those vessels arrive with containers, the federal agency has the responsibility and the accountability for those selective searches. My own understanding is that those searches are they're essentially risk-based, so they focused on boxes, as we call them, that they believe might have contraband of some kind. They also have a radioactive scan for public safety reasons. I'll note that we do have our own police force out at the Port of Portland and a great crew. There are issues with human trafficking, especially in airports, and we are very attuned to them, and they are tragic and awful. And I'll just say our team focuses on them pretty aggressively. It happens in a lot of airports with international connections. We don't have a lot of those because of where our flights go, but it is a focus, and it's a focus of our police department. And it's hard to put into words the scale of the tragedy in human trafficking, and we're just very sensitive to it.
I have a question on a card from the audience. The port has tried several times over the past 20 years to annex and rezone West Hayden Island. Each time it has been turned back due to concerns about impacts on the environment, the community, and whether there's a need for this project. What is the plan for this parcel of land, and is it time to give up trying to develop it and instead protect it for its resource values?
That's a great question. And just to be clear, I think the implied push is that we were seeking to annex it, and in fact it would be annexed by the city is conceptually the proposal. The last time, and I'll say before my time, the last time West Hayden Island came up, it was proposed by the mayor that the port would bring this piece of property into development, and that didn't go especially well. In large part, I'd say because the port did not articulate the specific use and a tenant that would come. It's about 800, a little less than 800 acres. It's a couple hundred feet from Terminal 6 across the channel, and it's the undeveloped side of what you all see when you cross on I-5. I would say, in part because it sits right next to the channel, and it is undeveloped. It's essentially former dredge spoils, but also sand development from years of historic migration of the river. There's a great opportunity out there. It is probably an opportunity that is both conservation and development. It sits right next to a Class 1 railroad. It runs right next to the property. So the idea that you would not contemplate industrial development there, I think, is not either fair or appropriate for the region. It is, I believe, mixed use currently. We've spent a lot of time looking at restoration and environmental development opportunities out there that would really access its proximity to what a good friend describes as the Salmon Superhighway, essentially to create a rest area on the Salmon Superhighway. There's great value there, especially in the bits that touch the water, obviously. And so habitat creation and restoration out there is clearly an opportunity that we shouldn't miss. I think it's probably a balance of those two things, and I'll say for the time being, we don't have any immediate plans. I do think in the long run, I described earlier this effort to reimagine our marine future and what we in the region expect from our connection to rivers and oceans. This has got to be a part of that. It can't just be industrial development. It's got to have a real strong environmental overlay.
Thank you. We'll go to another question from a City Club member at the microphone, please.
I'm Gerald Fox, a City Club member. One of the issues in the region has been the closure of the locks in Willamette Locks. And given the renewed interest in opening up the falls as a destination and the potential for river cruises and other activities, it would seem that the continued closure of these locks is most unfortunate. The port has the range of activities that would cover the work that's needed there and is also partly supported by taxpayers. Wouldn't this be an appropriate time to include the restoration of the locks within the range of port activities?
It's a great and really fascinating question, in part because it's a spectacular place out there, the locks, but also the falls. And in my former life as Governor Kitzhaber's Chief of Staff, we started some of the early investment from the state on redevelopment of the area around the falls at Oregon City. I'll say when it comes to the locks, I'm afraid my answer is no. I don't think it's a great nexus for us for a couple reasons. First, it's not really a viable or large trade focus. We more easily see trade coming up the Willamette Valley in trucks and by rail, and it's a lot cheaper to do it that way, in part because of the cost of that infrastructure. And I'd say second, and perhaps more importantly, we simply don't have the money. In terms of the cost of restoration and operation, it is very intimidating for us to look at other things, and I'll explain myself there if I can. I mentioned this 300 and some odd size, $320 million size business. 2/3 of that is at PDX, and that sum is essentially kept off limits from the rest of what we do by the Federal Aviation Administration. The FAA says essentially you aren't allowed to take revenue earned at the airport and spend it in other parts of the business. It's a kind of fun little story about Los Angeles, and I love telling bad stories about Los Angeles. The city of Los Angeles owns LAX, and once upon a time, about 20 years ago, they started siphoning money off of the airport and spending it on parks and police in Los Angeles because they didn't want to raise revenue in other ways. The FAA didn't have a big problem with it until it was sued by the airlines who said, we pay that money, that's our money, and we don't want it going to parks or police that have nothing to do with the taxes or the revenue that we spend at the airport. So revenue diversion prevents us from using what is really a wonderful asset, cash generator. If any of you want to get into a great new line of business, I suggest a monopoly parking lot. It is a great line of business. We can't use that revenue off premises. So what we have on the general fund side of the business, and it's the side of the business where we use that tax revenue that we raise to operate essentially our marine facilities and invest in capital required to maintain those marine facilities. That part of the business loses money every year. We're essentially living off of property sales and off of the sale of our headquarters about 10 years ago. So we are working, I would say, very diligently to try to get our own fiscal house in order and to really focus on a sustainable side of our marine and industrial business. You know, about 30 years ago, we were 60% marine business, 40% aviation. Now we're about 70% aviation and 30% marine and industrial. And that just tells you that you got to get your finances straightened out. And that just puts us in a position where taking on new challenges, big ones, while they might be interesting and even compelling, are just not in the range of our scope today.
Thanks. Next question from the microphone.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. You touched on seismic investment. I understand a fair amount of the airport and all of the fuel sources are on landfill. Is that part of your seismic investment to make sure that with this wonderful new airport, there's actually fuel to run the planes?
It's a great question, Virginia. Thank you. And just to be clear, by landfill, when we say it, we mean sand and not trash. Indeed, the airport, the entire airport facility, and most of our marine facilities are built on sand and highly liquefiable soil. So when they start shaking, I think of it every morning in my French press. The coffee, when I try to shake it out, you see liquefaction every day. It's really not good. It's very dangerous. When the big one comes, essentially it will shake the ground. Everything with air in it will come to the surface, and you'll see major shifts in essentially all the surface area. That does not bode well for our airport facilities, nor for our runways, quite honestly. And so we are thinking a lot about how to do that, how to make them resilient. Interestingly, our newer buildings are built to newer code, of course, and our headquarters building, which is above the long-term parking garage, you can kind of see it when you come out. It's the top 3 floors. That is a resilient building. It's a great place to be if you're out at the airport and you start feeling the ground shaking. Come see us at Port Headquarters. What we don't have is a resilient terminal core, and so that is absolutely a part of this project. It's an expensive part of the project. I mentioned it's about $1 billion. Over $300 million of that is going to resiliency, and that is really just boring down to the underlaying bedrock, and it's several hundred feet, and you have to put in many hundreds of pilings to get that building secure. So it's a big part of the story. It is going to be a part of everything we do out there at the airport, and you know, it's also not lost on us that the fuel facilities are at risk. They're actually not ours, so we are not able to go out, and I don't know how we would do it, but it's a big threat to the region that almost all of our fuel supply is out, essentially in an area that will most likely be crushed by a sliding hill on the Willamette River. And so it's a big threat. It's very upbeat, I know. Got everyone feeling good about themselves. One assumes, and the scenarios we've seen, fuel will be brought in other ways after a large earthquake, and we'll have to rebuild that infrastructure.
The second busiest airport in Oregon is Hillsboro, and it's another port property. Can you talk a little bit about the Hillsboro Airport and plans for that moving forward?
You bet. We've just started out at Hillsboro a master planning process to really rethink the future out there. It's a fascinating facility. It's the home of what is really an Intel private shuttle service. They fly 17 flights a day out of Hillsboro. It's also the home, and the reason for the high numbers, it's the home of a pilot training facility, which is one of the most frequently visited training facilities for Chinese pilots. So when you go in a Chinese airline now and you see the pilots, they're usually about 19 or 20 years old. It's very distressing. Most of them were trained out here on the West Coast, and a high number of them at Hillsboro. So it's also the home of Nike's corporate aircraft and a number of others, some small flight operators who do small cargo and private air services. It's a great strategic asset in the region, and interestingly, to the previous question, it's likely more resilient than our airfield. And so in case of emergency, fly to Hillsborough. It's a challenging, really a challenging airport as well, because it's very close to what is emerging as a population center. And when it began, Hillsborough had 60,000 people in it. And now that there are several 100,000 people out there, there's a lot more pressure on noise, on traffic, on flight volumes, the size of aircraft. And so it's something we're very sensitive to. We've got a great group working out there. It's essentially a 2-year process to review the long-term plan for investment and change.
Great. I think we have time for one last question from the floor.
Ted Kay, City Club member. Thank you for coming to the club. The port and the club share a long history. Presidents of the City Club have included Ogden Beeman, Maritime Manager at the port, Lloyd Anderson, Executive Director of the port, and City Club's very first research study in 1920 dealt with the port consolidation measures, so we go back a long way. One of our most recent studies is on earthquake preparedness in the Portland metro area. Beyond the heavy real estate investments that you're doing, what are your contingency plans if the big one hits today?
We're spending a lot of time thinking about it, and I think like most, the contingency plans are new or in development. A member of our executive team who's here, Stan Waters, is leading our effort and is also engaged with the state on what our role is relative to the state response. And I actually had the great fortune to visit Sendai in Japan. It's where the airfield was inundated by the tsunami in 2011. And 4 days later, after the arrival of the U.S. Marine Corps from Okinawa, reopened their airfield. Just an astonishing response. And so we're thinking a lot about it. We're engaged not only with our own team and our staff about what they individually do, but organizationally our role. And I'd say it's still early days.
Thank you.
We are out of broadcast time and we'll have to stop for the day. If this program's inspired you to join or contribute to City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. This is Lisa Watson from City Club's Board of Governors. Thank you so much to our guests, and special thanks to Daniel Capuya and the Friday Forum Committee for their hard work on today's program. We're adjourned.